All right. And for you folks, can anyone not see my screen right now? I've got our February 2023 governance call deck displayed. Yep. Beautiful.
I can see it.
I think there's really one major topic on the agenda today. I think we're going to give it one more minute for folks to join, but it's a continuation, I think, of largely the discussion that we had 2 sessions ago. After it kind of became relevant, like we probably need to tackle some of the questions that we have around the baseline in a more facilitated and a structured manner. And so for those of you that weren't on our session, I think 2 weeks ago, our governance session, we started to try to just draft up the questions that have been asked to date and concerns and anxieties, and then actually started to go through those and think through from our baseline perspective, what are the risks, the potential benefits, and I'll probably just display that out so you can see the types of questions that we've started to kind of tackle as a group. When we met, or I guess when we finished 2 weeks ago, we had really largely gotten through the first 2 and kind of started dipping into the third question. But the focus point being more around kind of our general relationship to other guides and content, both internationally and nationally, whereas the later questions, I think, are a little bit more focused on, questions that have come up in the group around more like program concerns and really fleshing out how true our anxiety is around some of the things that we've been hearing about, eventually a base or a baseline, being retired if the goals are met. And so our focus today, before I drive into these anymore, I think I'm going to give a recap of, what we've discussed up to date, and then we'll dive into the last 2 questions. My only other question before getting into it is whether or not there's anything in addition that we want to add to our agenda that folks want to make sure from a governance perspective that we talk through today. Okay, what about other major questions in addition to these 2 that we at least want to start touching on? Okay, we can loop back to it. What I'll I think, just to kick us off, is this going to be big enough for folks? Can you see? Zoom in. So in starting to think through our relationship to other content in the community, one of the major places that we spent discussion around last time was around the mechanisms that we have available to us and where formal derivation fits into that in our expectations as either a base or a baseline. And then we tried to delve a little bit more into, like, given that we are, as a baseline, taking a slightly different approach than some of the other bases, whether or not that changes the equation any amount, right? Because, for example, we have applied must supports in areas that, as a lot of bases, don't take that step, or in areas of here's where we are in the maturity. And so our expectation around the types of ways that folks may claim their relationships to us may be dependent on that. And then the last was, do we incur specific benefits or risk given our standing as a grassroots group, right? And the reason that I think it's so important for us to think through this from a structured perspective is that we know there are many different ways that guides can show relationships to each other. And, if what we're going to be asking as a community is to show this relationship through formal derivation, I think we need to assess the downstream risks that and potential benefits that may come with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my one comment in terms of the the grassroots nature of it, I think I think the only issue that we had there was in terms of definitional language around baseline versus core and what's the status of those two things. But in terms of if HL7 Canada chooses to say, here's the baseline, we're going to take it through a consensus-based review process with some and vote, we can do that. The challenge would be is that we'd want to probably solicit some more participation so that can be considered authoritative. In that sense, the authority that we have as a group comes from the degree of participation we have. And that might be an exercise that we go through to do that. But frankly, you know, all of the affiliates, some of the affiliates already vote internally in terms of what they're doing. We're getting ready to do that. We've been waiting for some tooling to do that, but we don't have to wait. I think that's one of the ways that we gain that level of authority. So it's just something to think about. I think that's still a very valid perspective, and I think it's a worthwhile one. So that's my only comment on that.
So is this a fair way of claiming that the risks or benefits that we're assessing right now around
Right.
this relationship, those individual variables could potentially change? Like, it's not that everything will continue exactly as it is.
No, that's true. That's true. It all depends upon. So, you know, for me, and I've stressed this before, whether we call them Fred and George, you know, core and baseline, definitely in my understanding of the concept of core, and this came up while we were in the meeting at the International Council, was that Alexander Henkert, for example, from the Netherlands. I said, let's forget about this, the words. What is the definition of these two different states of and types of deliverable, if you will, or specification? And the big thing being that while things that typically, and this is true for US core, things that are declared as core have been contextualized to be fit for a particular purpose, should not be assumed to be fit for all purposes. But what we do need is some degree of consistency in terms of the definition of the concepts of the resources, and that's where I think the baseline, or whatever we want to call it, falls in. So I think that's really the only difference there. I think that you know, again, in my mind, there's a difference between things that are definitional in terms of common reuse to create specifications that are normative, and allows us to do that in a coherent process. And I think that's what the opportunity is with this. So I think definitionally, I don't think there's a big issue with that. I think many people will see virtue in it. And I might mention, when this came up in the International Council meeting at HL7, Brett Markard, who's the leader of the US Realm Steering Committee, was in the room while parts of this conversation was underway. And essentially, he agreed that their lack of that definitional state, that basic state in terms of, you know, how do we express these concepts in a US context, was problematic, because what they were doing is they were creating normative things, and then other people were trying to do other things with those normative things, but they were incomplete or not properly contextualized for their specific needs. And so the big problem became, well, what do we do? You know,
Well,
do we
and the
branch?
problem, and the problem became when they were requiring, you know, other use cases to
Yes.
derive from the
Right.
more specific things, because
And that's really problematic, because once you've done that, you've taken a set of constraints for one purpose and you've assumed that those constraints apply in the other purpose. And I'm sorry, the way that the resources are defined, that's just too narrow a way to view the universe. So I think there's definitely a distinct role for each of these concepts in terms of definitional at the base, and then definitional in terms of for a particular purpose. Those are absolutely two essential things. It turns out in Alexander's case, for example, in Netherlands, he calls it all core, but it turns out that as part of core, they do have a baseline definition. They don't call it baseline, it's still core, but whenever they have a new profile come along that's fit for a purpose, they go back and they match that against that sort of starting point, and they determine, oh, there's something different about this. Is what's different appropriate to be utilized by everyone? And if so, they go through a governance process to change that thing. So that further derivation from it will have that added value, so to speak. Or if not, okay, that's fine. But just as long as the thing that they're creating is consistent. So in fact, in terms of his process, without the same naming, he has exactly what I just described in terms of that ability to have a reference point from which you derive normative things.
Yeah, I don't find a value to the distinction or even having the terms core and baseline. I mean, core was
Yeah.
chosen because, if you will, the intention was, and the intention is right, is to create an inheritance hierarchy, right? Where you start at some point and then say, okay, everything else, and that would be, what you think of as a base. Everything else now inherits from this point down. The difficulty in doing an inheritance hierarchy, however, is your assumption of what all the scope is that falls below any point.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
So how would we pose that? Is that a risk, Paul? Because I mean, if we're saying, okay, we fit somewhere in this inheritance chain, we've talked about there being a benefit to use case agnosticism, but I think you're talking about like the scope of what ends up using your guide being outside of your control.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I'm defining what you're doing, and then we can stand back from that and say, okay, so the risk is if you require a given level, inheritance level, to apply to all things below it, if it hasn't actually had the input of all things below it, it is likely to be misaligned, which is exactly the case of US Core. US Core looked only at clinical information and then said, this is the base from which everything else will derive, which of course was completely inaccurate for administrative and financial information. And the struggle that they've had politically as well as physically is to A, recognize that, and then B, go back and put the inheritance levels above that point at which they started to correctly represent that. So there's certain things which may be true across all the use cases, let's say in the US, from which you then might inherit down into administrative, financial, clinical, at which point they start to depart. And then the clinical, your emergency medicine departs from your oncology, departs from your et cetera, et cetera. So your risk is not taking, but that's the common risk in standards.
Well, it is, yeah.
All the information from the different domains and being assumptive for the things down below.
Yeah.
And I like the process that the Netherlands has taken. They're pretty good and pragmatic about this, is, set yourself up a pattern and an approach and set up a process for going back and adjusting when what you did was wrong. Because whatever you do will be wrong at any point in time.
Yeah, that's in some dimension. So the key here is that, yes, it is a risk, but here's the thing. What you do to manage that risk is, turns out that effort associated with assessment and then subsequently determining what a course of action, that's a governance process.
Yeah.
And so what we're talking about is that, yes, if we want to have these things at these different level of differentiation, they are governed in the sense that people say, yes, this is what we need this for. Is it fit for this particular purpose? Yes or no? We go around correcting that. And then should we find that what Paul has described has occurred, because of course we can't imagine every possible need in the world at the outset, then you have a process to go through resolving that in a measured, managed method. And that requires community, and that requires that sort of coherence across the community, which you get.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because one of the pieces that we talked about 2 weeks ago was, one of the challenges with our current setup is that, we would, if we were saying, okay, folks, like, take that extra step, directly derive, is that we would introduce additional governing bodies into the process that, right, like we don't necessarily, that the folks who would inherit from us don't have control over, right? And each potential layer, let's say we end up with something like the baseline, if that's truly the foundation, something else that constrains over that, and something else that constrains over that, we have a potential as a grassroots group a strong community, but still a grassroots community, where we are an additional governing node
Well,
that
If
Sorry.
you don't, then by definition, every project and user is a governing body.
that's correct. There you go.
So yes, I agree, it's more work, but it's way less work than if you don't.
And I don't know if it's necessarily a whole other governing body. It's a different process related to a different set of artifacts. And the HL7 as a governance environment actually has many of these things, right? That they manage through those processes. So I'm not as concerned about the fact that people will feel somebody we don't know is going away and telling us we can or can't do things. That would not be what the process was. The process would be that everything is done transparently in front of all of the participants. You know, that's the premise of having an HL7 Canada. And that follows all of those rules associated with transparency and balanced representation and other things like that. That's really it. So I'm a little less worried about that as long as we fulfill that mission, if you will, in terms of the way that we deal with things.
Well, but right now, Ron, we're not doing that.
yes,
No, I know
think
we're-
that's the
yes, that's
reality we
correct.
have to assess against here.
Yeah.
Yes. So, you know, the BC guides have committed to inheriting from the baseline, but they would like clarity about how the baseline's governed and how it's governed relative to core and what Infoway thinks about as core.
Yeah.
So it's not so much the definitions, because I think we can go back and
Work that out.
Work that out based on the things we've been talking about. It's how are we working together as a community, and I don't think that is smooth right now.
Right. Well, so again, so when there was a governance exercise or an assessment done of what it would take to establish governance of standards, that was one of the things that was addressed and came up there. And I think you're right. I mean, to be honest, though, under the context of HL7 Canada, which has an entitlement in terms of the way that it goes about, and actually in the current relationship we have, it states clearly that only the affiliate can declare what is an authoritative baseline for a particular domain. Now, whether the people in the domain accept it or not, as far as HL7 is concerned, that's the case. So if we chose to start setting up some governance processes around baseline, because I think that's a very wise thing to do, regardless of whatever else happens downstream, that can happen. We just have to really, this has been the compelling catalyst for that from the outset, and we're there.
Yeah, because we have to be careful that so often in these sort of governance circumstances, what happens is because of territorial scope, people misalign where the value is. And what you want to see is the value in being able to have things which are reusable by implementations. The value should not be seen to be in owning the baseline.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So unless human beings are fundamentally different across the provinces, we should profoundly discourage a BC baseline versus an Alberta baseline.
Yes, we want consistency across how we adopt things around, at least the basics across the country.
Right. And you should also be careful that while, as I worded, I'm proud to be Canadian, but what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Right. And so if we're talking healthcare, we should only be as Canadian as we need to and no more.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think what we have to acknowledge that as potentially another variable here in our approach, in that in some of our decisions for the types of things that we may put conditional rules on and the application of must support, while they reflect Canadian, like practices that are in place in Canadian, they may not reflect practices that are solely Canadian. And, places that I should say other bases, national bases, that are going through these same conversations have a very different starting point than us. They've made decisions that maybe are lesser, but lesser in scope, but they really are solely focused on what's the identifiers that we expect to be used. And so we have to consider this, that we're coming from a different starting point, and that the impacts of that, of trying to fit into a square hole.
Yeah, sorry. It's a double-edged sword. The beauty of it is it allows you to document how you're not interoperable with others, which then can allow us to have those conversations about how we could be interoperable with others.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's formalisms associated with the process, and again, this all goes back to the concept of consensus-based. Is that then you have a mechanism whereby you can do those kinds of comparisons and make decisions, informed decisions, and then do and react to that situation in a constructive manner. Yeah, anyway, so one of the things, Sheridan, is again, I appreciate what you're saying. I mean, we don't have those mechanisms in place right now, but they're begging to be in place regardless. And so what I'm prepared to do is start having some conversations and also define some of the processes that we need to have in place for that to actually work.
But I think if they're begging to be in place, like, then our community also, if we are saying as a community, we're raising our hand and we think that we should be asking for more from the baseline, we think that these are the activities, then it's our responsibility to understand the impact of that recommendation in our own ecosystem. And
yes,
so I don't want to shortchange this conversation. And like, one of the questions that we have that I think would be helpful to kind of get through today, beyond kind of this layering piece, is starting to think through like this idea of mutual exclusivity and kind of tenure of meeting the goals. Is there anything beyond, before we talk a little bit in this space, that folks want to dive into a little bit more on benefits, risks, with our specific approach as it is today, or in how layers, the various layers that we're expecting are going to be part of this ecosystem may have a impact on what we would recommend? Because I know one of the things that we talked about is like, we have more than one mechanism outside of reprofiling or derivation that we had put forward to our implementer community. Are folks interested in exploring and re-socializing what we've previously identified and figure out how that fits into this layers piece?
I mean, it sounds like we couldn't really go much further without doing exactly that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, the approaches we had were more around, they were still talking about conform or complying to the baseline. They were about how computably or formally are we doing it, or how informally are we doing it. It wasn't about whether we were addressing the baseline or not, right? Because we talked about, a logical comparison to make sure that the constraints were the same, and moving that down to actually computably declaring a dependency and inheriting from. They were still conceptually trying to be aligned.
Yep.
It was just how computably we're trying to do it.
So it might, let me at least, like kind of step through at least what those options are around this conceptual alignment, that at the time that we identified for folks that may be kind of new to some of these conversations, just to provide context. So when we were originally going out and talking to the jurisdictional, their governing bodies and asking for their iGuide authors to start utilizing the baseline and identifying their method of alignment. We had identified 4 mechanisms, some of them less technical than others, as ways of connecting back to the baseline content and making statements about the ways that you were kind of demonstrating that informal conformance. And so when we originally put this forward, we had it was a technical alignment deck is what we called it for the iGuide publishers. And really the 4 that are covered with their various pros and cons is, I think, Lorraine, like you mentioned, it's like you can kind of do that comparison, make sure that you're aligned, but not formally make any ties between your guide content and the baseline. That tends to be pretty effort intensive. We spend a lot of time in our group doing that basically for due diligence reviews, but it's an easy way without incurring, any of the risks or the complexity to make a statement at a certain point in time that you've looked at the baseline and you incorporate all of its constraints. The one that we looked at that might be more kind of event-based or, around guides that might be producing examples as they mature to be able to demonstrate that they can align to the guide would be around instance validation. So, walking through what you can do to show if you create an example that is conformant to your guide, how you might also put in the, essentially the meta tag that says this is also conformant to the baseline. So really just more around a testing approach, and not specifically maybe capable of meeting all of our needs around doing that must support comparison. The third one is really around iGuide dependencies, right? Which was primarily for folks who anticipated that they would be utilizing pieces of the CA baseline directly, like extensions or value sets or certain profiles, particularly if you wanted to incorporate those into your guide. iGuide dependencies was one way that we would be able to track who was utilizing the baseline, and that allows for you to pull in what you need without having kind of rigid rules if your profiles aren't directly built on top of all the contents in the baseline iGuide. And then the fourth one was the kind of what we consider the most rigid, and it's usually what in the iGuide community, if you're going to be reprofiling outside of your controlled space, you want to ensure you utilize when things have relatively stabilized, would be that kind of derivation or reprofiling that we've largely been talking about today and 2 weeks ago, which means you build directly on top of the CA baseline profile or whatever the profile you're describing. It gives the most benefits, but it also has the most risks, given the fact that it makes it more difficult to go out of alignment when you have something that really isn't appropriate for your particular use. So, like, thinking back on these 4 options that we talked to our implementers about, should we be expanding the conversation about where we think the baseline has to play amongst our larger community to think about offering up these as options that we would be promoting? Because I think we really only talked about this to date. You folks can see my screen, right? I haven't just been talking.
Yes.
Okay.
But we said that, but the last of this, I missed which was this?
Oh, reprofiling, the last.
Okay. I mean, generally, that's where people want to go. If they want to computably say that they are compliant, they want to computably connect and reprofile. And that's what BC did, at least in the draft for provider registry. Because a bunch of the rest, none of the rest are computably verifiable, really, other than maybe instance validation. But that's not something that that's something that the client instances that are connecting to a FHIR server have more control over than an implementation guide that's specifying how clients interact with a jurisdiction, for instance.
And so when we talk about computably verifiable, that is something that we, if we're trying to say, hey, this is what we'd like to all folks to pursue, the driving factor behind that is just ensuring compliance, right? And efficiency. The reason I ask is we've always said from the outset that folks are going to have different levels of comfort and different rationales behind why they choose some mechanisms over other. And we had to, as a grassroots iGuide, allow for that because we didn't have the authority to constrain for it. And we knew the community would take a lot of movement to get to the point where everybody would be comfortable with a single mechanism.
Understood.
And so I guess my question is like, has that changed?
I don't know.
I don't think that has, in the sense that those parties don't have an umbrella governance within which they can understand how that will be managed and how the processes are associated with it. So in the absence of that construct, I don't think that much has changed there, other than I think our understanding of what we need is very strong, but I don't think that we've got it in place. So I think the only way that we can claim to go to another level is to actually see those constructs put in place that allow that kind of participation as well as governance over affecting change. I think that's the only way we'll get to those spots. So I think that's something we should make a plan for, though. And yeah, that's something that we're going to have to figure out pretty quickly, I think. So we can't just keep, kicking this can down the road. So I'm offering to start having some conversations with the sponsor of HL7 Canada, Infoway, around what that means. I'll need some assistance to do that, but at the same time, the whole principle behind the way in which we're formed is designed, and by that I mean HL7 Canada is designed to support this kind of activity. We just have to do it at this point. We didn't really have a compelling rationale for doing it earlier. When we were in this transition out of V3 into FHIR, everyone was extremely tentative. And I think we're beyond tentative now. Now there's a sense of commitment, certainly globally there is. But what we have not done is matured in terms of our ability to address that. And that's because of the absence of that overarching governance construct. So I think that's what we got to do next. In the meantime, until that happens, I think, that's our aspiration, Sheridan, but I think you're correct. Until that changes, I don't think that circumstance, that context has actually changed yet. We need that other stuff to be true in order for that to work.
And I think that might lead to a question that we have down here, which is like, all of this anxiety and the momentum, which is both positive and scary, I think has come up in our community. Please, someone play devil's advocate, challenge if you think this is wrong. But I feel like a lot of this has come up because of this idea of a core being out there that would, I don't know if it's that it would subsume us or that it would overlook us, but I feel like there's been a cognitive jump that I'm trying to piece back with our approach, right? Which is, we have these goals, right? We want to ensure that we are creating the proliferation of concepts through kind of trying to express what's common and encouraging that practice, right? Trying to expose multiple stakeholders in our community to what they can expect and to soft enforce, the harmonization around these concepts through education. And so I think the question that I have for our community is that outcome and is that goal different just because additional guides are entering into the fray? Basically, do we think we can achieve this goal if there is another national iGuide in play?
Well, it depends upon where that national iGuide is positioned.
Is it attempting to fulfill this purpose, which is a broad spectrum concept definition in terms of representation of things, as Paul says, that are, distinctly Canadian and no more, keeping that limited.
Yeah. I mean,
the
some of it is because we're addressing different use cases at different points in time.
Yeah.
There
Right.
should be different.
Go ahead. Sorry, Paul. I interrupted you.
I'm sorry. I'm actually, I think I'm probably interrupting you, so I apologize. The whole point, and I think the only point for creating a profile is to express requirements.
Yep.
Right. So you're expressing things which are intended to be consistent for this use case and derivative use cases coming from it. So no two profiles should be the same because redundancy is unnecessary. And there should be a building of requirements from the base profile, which is in fact FHIR, which contains elements but no requirements, right? There's no sense that a given resource is being intended for any particular use case. And as you work down an inheritance hierarchy, you start to put those constraints on which are applicable for a scope underneath that hierarchy, but silent on things which are not crystallized at the level of that hierarchy. So you progress from the resource, which you can think of as being an abstract definition of an information requirement, to you eventually get down to implementation profiles, which are completely prescriptive with respect to what the information model is. There should be no example terminologies.
And something is, for instance, we're trying to be consistent with each other.
Right.
But
and
we're
beneficially consistent.
Yes, but we're sometimes tackling different pieces of the use case. For instance, right now Ontario has an e-referral implementation guide that's well advanced. They've been working on it for a number of years. They have attacked some pieces of things that touch on, for instance, a healthcare service directory, but that wasn't in their scope. So they just dealt with the edge pieces around it. BC is looking at the healthcare service directory right now. And so we're trying to be consistent, but we're also talking about different pieces of the domains and what edges together, and then trying to figure out what of those things are really sort of common baseline things is something we're still muddling through overall as a community. And then there's this, we get a FAQ that says, oh, well, we're just going to subsume the baseline and it's going to go away. And all the community that has worked on that are going, well, what does that really mean?
Yeah.
What it means is we are eliminating any discussion or documentation of common requirements.
Yeah.
I would challenge that. I think
Sure.
The purpose of this discussion is to be able to really think through them analytically. And I want to I think there's so much still unknown about what it would mean for a guide to subsume the baseline that we couldn't jump to the conclusion that it would eliminate common requirements.
Or just a second, sorry. How did you mean by subsuming the baseline?
Or if in the FAQs, right, it said eventually, and I probably should get the exact language, but the fear in this community and what we've reacted to date is that that the baseline would be replaced and that it wouldn't necessarily be a continuing artifact that that something would be completely derived off of.
Okay, so can I let me just pull that thread a tiny bit because I want to make sure
Yeah.
that's clear. So are we saying that gotten rid of and we don't need it anymore, or are we saying updated because we have new requirements?
I think that's what we don't know, and I think we're all jumping to the worst.
Yes, correct.
scenario.
Then I'll go back to defend my statement for really simple reasons. The profile is no more, or this baseline profile. What we're really talking about is a profile, and that profile is no more than a formal expression of requirements, which are held to be true for all use cases below the point at which you establish that. And that's why I'm saying if you decide to throw the profile away, what you're doing is you're throwing away a formalism of requirements, because it has no other point
And just
Yeah,
for
that's
that I can imagine.
just for clarification, the context put from that FAQ was essentially put that the baseline would be tossed and the core would be built from a different source directly. It was
yeah.
implied
So
that way.
I don't
So
know
that
what
was
you mean
why
by
people,
core then. So
Well-
have you established two things, a baseline and you're trying to establish a core,
Trying
which is also a profile at some level of the inheritance chain, and you're trying to say, well, maybe we won't base this on something higher up. We'll base it on yet some other thing. Having these two terms, I find is non-contributory, right? It doesn't help.
yeah,
If you just think of it as you've got the FHIR spec, which is an abstract specification, and now you're going to say, well, we're going to develop the initial Canadian patient profile from which all other patient profiles in Canada should in fact be a logical subset. You'll find you're not going to add very much into that profile, right?
I guess
Because
the
that's
point-
a very broad statement.
I guess the point was the way they portrayed core
Yes.
wasn't the patient core. It was Canada core covering everything.
Let's
Yeah,
let's talk about that statement, Randy. I'm just trying to figure out where it actually is in this document. Distinction between the concepts of baseline and core. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to use the term core to say for a given domain, core is the starting point for that domain, then okay, that could be a useful referential term. But where that particular profile for a domain is going to inherit from depends on the level of that domain in the hierarchy of domains.
So let's take the statement at what it is, right? Learnings incorporated over current time will be retired and replaced. So I don't think I don't interpret that meaning that we're throwing away the established set of requirements. I interpret that to be, we take the requirements, we incorporate them, and once incorporated, there may not be a need for continuation of an artifact that's entire purpose is to maintain just those constraints.
Oh, well,
They
then there's
discussed-
also no need that, right, then there's also no requirement to maintain those constraints. So if you
Mhm.
will, if you think of 3 different domains that are halfway down the hierarchy mentally, and if they're not all inheriting from a common thing, then those starting points for those 3 domains can vary over time. If that's what you want to achieve, then that would be the good way to achieve it. But that may not be what you want to achieve, because if that's true of the root of that domain, it's just as true for everything above it and everything below it. Right? Why should breast oncology have to be constrained by some other oncology as well? Right?
The thing is,
just
it was implied in here that this baseline would be starting with the base or starting from the US core view and building from that. And then, as it says here, applying CA baseline learnings.
okay. I would absolutely,
Which
as a recommendation,
seems
not start
wrong
with
way.
US core.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul. Sorry, just got stepped on there, Paul. Can you
Yeah, sorry.
repeat that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would absolutely, as a recommendation, not start with US core, because US core started several layers down the tree.
I'm
And-
having trouble finding where that is.
That may not be in the FAQ
It
because
was,
it was
I
stated in
thought
the
it was in
meeting.
the FAQ document itself.
It was somewhere, whether it was documented or just vocalized during a meeting, I don't recall, but that was,
No, it was written down for sure, because I saw it after the meeting.
that it may have been in that handout during that meeting.
So, but at any rate, rather than making a Sheridan search for it, I think the discussion we have comes down to, frankly, a communication and organizational trust discussion. Really, because if we were confident that the communication between the work that's going on that's coming out of IPS and going on to CA Core was communicating back and forth with the groups that are trying to contribute to the baseline, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
That's true.
Paul, do you feel that way after your last statement? Because I thought what your last statement was if the core is similarly use case agnostic and is the place for those requirements, it's fine. But if the core is someplace for a different set of expectations, then even if in the best of scenarios where we had the right communication bidirectionally in place.
The thing is that the core is just a profile of some scope. And the baseline is just a profile of some scope. So they're really the same thing. Now, if all I was saying,
no. If the scopes were the same, that would be true, but I don't think the scopes are the same.
No, but they are both just profiles with
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
Yeah. And so
that's true.
And that's why, to me, they're not different. Now, if they're trying to use the term core to say, okay, we're going to define an oncology core, an emergency medical core, an outpatient core, they can do that. But you'll start to see that those domains are not at the same, what you think of as the same level in a hierarchy.
Yeah. So
it's beneficial to say, listen, whenever we're sending outpatient information, you have to send these 4 bits of information and you have to use these code sets, right? That's hugely beneficial to drive interoperability. But
so I think where the discomfort is coming from is we're taking, the project that's defining the Canadian IPS, International Patient Summary, Canadian version thereof. And we're using that to define the Canadian reference architecture, the Canadian technical integration piece, and the Canadian core, starting from a specific use case with what I think most of the community feels is not enough communication and transparency. So I think the reason this isn't so much about baseline and core, I think this is about how do we develop and position our implementation guides within our community and the comfort about how we're doing it.
Yeah, and certainly the profiles that would be used in the Canadian version of the IPS are many levels down that stack from the root. They're not the first level, they're not the top level.
So I think that's my problem with the assumption is that twofold. One is I think the starting point is by definition, particularly the summary, a reduction, if you will, of the potential scope of utilization of those resources for many different purposes. It's a summary, right? That doesn't mean it includes everything. It doesn't mean it summarizes all things. It just says that in order to be able to express concisely and cogently certain basic information about the patient, this is what we need, which seems to me to be, you know, the wrong place to start if you're going to try and define that at a more broad level.
Oh,
And then the
I've
second,
go ahead. Sorry, Ron. I mean, I'm just going to amplify that your first point, because I've been in conversations in the last 6 months where someone on when we were discussing what the value set for problems should be in condition, and
Yeah.
the assertion was, well, we shouldn't cover all of that scope because that's not part of IPS. Where
Right,
our value
exactly.
set for problem has to be broader than just IPS. As an
Much
example.
broader than IPS, much
Yeah.
broader than IPS. So, and again, back to the transparency thing. So I do appreciate that the work that was underway for IPS and exchange had a multi-stakeholder perspective, but I think, for example, this baseline crew group, which is a grassroots group, had been going through this whole process at the same time and had no visibility into that activity at all, which
I
is
don't know if that's
surprising.
true either, because many of us on this call are involved in IPS.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Okay, but so frankly, Sheridan,
So
I ignored IPS because I thought it was about IPS.
Yep.
I didn't think it was about defining a reference architecture for Canada.
And I think that messaging, I think, is
Mhm.
maybe slightly off. I think the idea is that a need for guidance on types of exchange patterns and reference architecture presented in a space where our Canadian communities were working on a use case, and that was the natural next step and gap that needed to be filled, is not the same thing as saying we build these around solely the idea of IPS. And so, you know, I think that there's a lot that's still to be said. Attila has agreed to present in March, specifically to help clarify some of those questions. But
but the work and the communications and getting feedback all went out under the banner of IPS, which meant the people who looked and paid attention to give feedback were people who were actively interested in IPS, right? So it wasn't a broad community that gave feedback. It was a focused community that gave feedback.
Yep.
Right.
And I think outside of that, right, it's not a closed cycle. So, you know, I would say I would be speaking outside my role to say anything right now other than let's actually ask along those places. We're going to hear from the community about what the next touch points are. But I don't think we can interweave it into this conversation about, like, I understand the trust point and I want to acknowledge that, because it is what you're trying to point out is like, it's this theme that we want to make sure that what gets built represents our needs. But I think we have to we have to disentangle that from, as a baseline community, how would we position ourselves in this space? And like, I want to get back a little bit to what Paul was thinking, because I do actually think that there's something here that we should drill into, which is around that scope piece, right? Which is, we have said from the very beginning, we're use case agnostic, and that's the level that we are. I'd like us to examine what it means if a core would have the exact same scope, and what it means to this question, and what it would mean if the core didn't have the same scope. Because I actually think that is probably going to be really critical in us understanding whether or not we would be comfortable with being replaced if the scopes are different.
Well, the replacement is illogical to me. In a inheritance hierarchy, you don't replace. You might change because you've learned something that needs to be included, and it needs to be included at a level above where you previously introduced it. But you don't, these things don't get replaced and go right back to the base again. Otherwise, there's no point to having an inheritance hierarchy, right? It fundamentally undermines reuse. So if you're going to be use case agnostic, then you've got to be at some level above right? You're still at an abstract layer. You're still conceptually dealing with something. You're not concretely dealing with the implementation of it yet. So you've got to decide, at what level am I abstract? Am I talking Canada, let's say take the patient resource. Canada-wide, is there anything that we need to stick in the patient resource that every patient resource in Canada must contain? And you could maybe say the identifier as a must support, but not as a required, because unconscious patients tend not to have identifiers.
Yeah, well, there are probably a few extensions that we would decide we want to use, but not even as a required or must support.
Well, they could be available. And so you might start to add those in so that they're available all the way down the stack, even though they're not necessarily required in certain areas. And then later on they become required. So that can guide people and make it more difficult for people to do redundant things.
Yeah,
right?
and so that we do things.
Unnecessary diversity is unnecessary diversity.
So we do things the same way. Right now, we're talking about how do we differentiate between a patient who is formally rostered or just on an active patient list, for example, in extensions. And taking a consistent approach to those things is probably, once we sort of how to do it, is probably a good thing.
It is beneficial, right?
Yeah.
But if I am inside a system and I'm the lab result talking back to the system, giving the results of a lab test that was previously ordered, that nuance or that bit of data is irrelevant to me, right? Because we already have it. We already have an identifier, which will be used for the person. So whether they're rostered or not, who cares, right? So at that level, that information is no longer required. So you've got to be careful that you haven't made it a requirement upstairs in the hierarchy, such that we're burdening, right? We're just adding burden as you go down the hierarchy for implementations, because the burden is not only hard from a work perspective, the relevance of what we're doing ceases to be seen by implementers.
So is this what you're saying, Paul? Like, for us to say, well, we sit at this place of use case agnosticism when we have some of these constraints, may be a fallacy?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, for example, use the US as an example, because we can sort of stand away from that, right? They want to have race and ethnicity on patients. Okay, so you can have someone turn around and say, well, as a baseline, we do that in the States, so we're going to make those two fields or those two extensions requirements. And yet that would be meaningless and wasteful to actually have that as a requirement for subsystems, which are just trying to send the patient ID to somebody, right? Here's the meal for the patient, here's their ID. Right? At that point in time, shuttling this data around because somebody in a requirements group said this field was necessary, right, is now methodologically sound, but from a business and a functional perspective, a waste of time. Right? And that's how we start to kill our relevance.
So what's the takeaway here? Is it that
be careful
with the constraints that we've applied, we should be careful of being up?
Absolutely.
In the
we have to be really careful that the constraints that we apply, what we're saying is when we put something into a profile, or we're saying this constraint is true and applies for all things below this if we make it required. So we need to be right when we say that. If we're not right, then people will ignore the work we're doing. And so they should.
And we've been able to reach, I think, the point of comfortability with where we're at as a guide that's intended to inform but not enforce through due diligence reviews by relaxing things that we find are not consistent across other guides. But that level of confidence is a lot different than like what would need to be in place for us to say, yes, we are absolutely sure inherit away. If you're saying this true use case agnosticism typically results in almost no constraints, if any.
Well,
Well,
no,
you
you
know,
should be able to
only way-
result in constraints as you go down.
Well,
What
the
you
only way
don't
to
wanna
actually do that in practice is what you've been doing, Sheridan, I think,
Yeah.
is providing what you think is what we think as a community is our reasonable first cut, and then
Mhm.
trying it and using it. And when we find things that are too tight because of use cases that vary, discussing it and changing it. I think what you've been doing is the right process. I don't know if there's any other way to do that.
And it is beneficial, but you have to recognize that you may in time discover that the level at which you apply to constraint isn't the right level. That constraint might need to go up or might need to go down. And that's the governance process, would be to move that, and then people can have trust in it. And unfortunately, I'm going to point out the fact it's 2 minutes after.
No,
and
yeah.
two of us have- So
So clearly there's a lot more that we have to talk on this front. I'll end the call in the regular housekeeping piece, which is we'll end the recording, make sure it's shared on the iCloud. I think it would make sense, unless I hear otherwise from folks, for us to continue on this slide when we return. And if there are other questions or points that folks want to make their way into our next discussion, please share them over email or on the forum, so that we can make sure folks who want to be involved are active on the meeting.
Yep.
I'll have to leave
Yeah.
some of these off on, like, we might have to return to finish off some of these thoughts.
Yeah, and I think if we can, the methodology for establishing a profile at any level should be consistent. So that what you're talking about is not simply how do we establish the baseline, but how do we establish any of those levels?
Yeah, which is another challenge, I think, to consider in our current ecosystem.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right, so folks, I guess we keep having a reason to keep meeting, so I will see you folks next week if you're here for profiling, 2 weeks from now if you're here for governance. Have a good long weekend for folks that have it, and we'll see you on the flip side.
That's
Thank you.